Hello and welcome to the Shattering Triangles podcast, our special series entitled Joseph the Believer. I'm Josh Chandler, and I'm joined here by Cameron Mayer. And today we're going to talk about some of the early history of the Smith family, and in particular, we want to talk about the events leading up to the visit of Moroni and some of the events that may or may not actually have happened in the early life of Joseph Smith, and try to give you an idea of his perspective. Some of the topics we're going to cover today relate to treasure hunting, magical practices type stuff. So if that's what you're interested in, you're in a good place to hear about that. If you don't want to hear about that, then you should skip this episode possibly. But I think it's a worthwhile topic, and there's a lot to cover. And I'll say this, at the risk of raising the bar, which you never want to raise the bar too high. But Cam and I have spent quite a number of weeks discussing the things that we wanted to talk about in this episode and what would be most useful and most important. And I really feel excited to get into all the stuff that we talked about, Cam. I don't know with that. What thoughts do you have, Cam, as we kind of get to look at this again?
Oh man. Nothing in particular, probably. I think starting with some of the context that we discussed, relative to Joseph's upbringing will probably be important to get into their financial situation and all that fun stuff. And then the picture sort of naturally paints itself, I think. And we'll get into some interesting principles along the way.
Yeah, so let's do that. So we're going to go back for a minute so that we can understand Joseph Smith. Remember, this is between the first vision, which is roughly 1820. I know Joseph in 1838 says it's spring of 1820. I suspect he's probably correct. I think it's materially accurate to say it could be in the anywhere between 19 and 21, 22 even. But we're going to go back to try to understand the period between the first vision and then leading up to the visit of Moroni, which, for those who don't recall, was the evening of the September 21st and 22nd in the Smith farmhouse. If you go to the Sacred Grove or to the Smith sort of the church's land holdings there in Palmyra, there's a replica of the cabin that the Smiths lived in that was actually built on the same foundation where Moroni visited. That was 1823. So somewhere, 3-4 years, which in the life of a kid that age is a lot. We're going to try to understand that time period and then a little bit after it. But to do that, we're going to go back in time because we need to understand the kind of family that Joseph Smith was living in. So we're back in 1796. Put 1796 in context, 1796 is just 7 years after the ratification of the Constitution. The president of the United States in 1796, depending on when in 1796 we're talking, is still George Washington. Actually, it might just be, I can't remember when his first term ended, but George Washington is the president in 1796. So we're talking quite a while ago. This is the year that Joseph Smith Sr. marries Lucy Mack. When they get married, the Smith and Mack families both give them some significant gifts. From the groom's side, the Smiths get part ownership of a 4-year-old farm. That is 4 years old is kind of important because in New England, when you buy a piece of land, it's covered in trees and rocks and other things that keep it from being meaningfully farmable. But their farm had been cleared and it was ready to go. They got part ownership of this farm, including a dwelling where they could live in Vermont. This is a place called Tunbridge, Vermont. And from the bride's family, from her brother, actually, they got $1,000 in cash. And so because they had that $1,000 in cash, and then they also had this dwelling, they had enough resources actually at the time that they got married that they got to save the entire $1,000 in cash, and they just had a cash reserve. To put in perspective how big this cash reserve is, we're jumping forward a little bit, but when the Smiths sell their farm, they get $800 cash for the farm. So, $1,000 in cash back then, is the price of a middle class or a pretty decent farm. You might think of it, just to put in perspective, something like, whatever you would pay for a decent sized middle class home today. That's how much they had in savings. So it's a pretty significant amount. And it actually is really remarkable for them to be able to have that, and then to be able to give that much, receive that much as a gift, and then to be able to save it. So not long after that, about 6 years later, they become landlords as well, because what happens is Joseph Smith Sr. Opens a store in Randolph, Vermont, which is about, I don't know, 6 or 7 miles, I want to say, from Tunbridge, not far. And the reason he goes into storekeeping is in part because Lucy's brother, the one who gave them $1,000 in cash, is in storekeeping and is doing really well, and probably has the resources and ability to teach Joseph what to do. And Joseph has enough education to be able to do that. So, and they rent out the farm. So the farm that they had before that they were living in, they rented it out. They got a new house in Randolph, presumably over top of the store that they had opened. And the store goes really well. In fact, local farmers are purchasing their goods from the Smiths, but they do it on credit. So they're selling lots and lots of inventory, but the payment is not due on these goods until after the farmers sell their crops at the harvest time. So the way this kind of an economy worked at the time, the way the Smiths would do it is they would actually purchase their inventory on credit from a wholesaler in Boston, probably, although we don't know this, but it seems likely that's the same wholesaler that was being used by Lucy's brother. And then after the harvest, everyone squares up with cash. Around the same time, Joseph Sr. branches out into some other ventures. One of the things he starts doing is buying and collecting ginseng root, which some of you know what that is. Some of you don't. If you don't, it's actually a really nice supplement for mental clarity. I take it myself, which, I don't know what that says about me, but whatever it says about me, I like it. I think it's useful. And it was very popular in China, and you could get a lot of money for it. So Joseph had collected enough around this time, not long after they opened the store. I don't know if it was their very first season or somewhat slightly later than that. Had collected enough ginseng that a local merchant by the name of Stevens offered Joseph Sr. $3,000 cash for his season's collection of ginseng. So go back again, $3,000 cash is the price, is 3 times the price of a really nice farm. So I don't know what Joseph had in the ginseng. I don't know how much money he'd spent for it, but I know he was offered $3,000 for the ginseng. So if you add it all up, they've got $1,000 cash from Lucy's family. They own the farm. They own the dwellings and improvements on the farm without any mortgage on it. And then they own the ginseng. And then they have the amounts that are owed by local farmers to them in excess of what's owed to the wholesaler for inventory. You could pretty straightforwardly peg their net worth at something like $5,000. You could put that in perspective 2 ways. You could say, if the price of a decent middle class home is $300,000 today, which I don't know if that's right, but that seems in the ballpark, Cam, then their net worth is something like $1.5 million. That's pretty good, actually. In an affidavit from the 1830s, there's another way to put it in context. Martin Harris's wife, Lucy, places the peak of Martin Harris's wealth at something like $10,000. That's his net worth, allegedly. So the Smiths are not quite in that realm of Martin Harris, but from where they stand, they can pretty much see how they could get there in just a couple more years. So that's where the Smiths start out, or not where they start out, but that's where they kind of are at this time, which is, we'll call it, it's rough. It's not long before Joseph Smith is born, or maybe, yeah, it's a couple of probably 4 or 5 years before Joseph Smith Jr. is born. But in the actual event, what happens is Joseph Smith Sr. does not sell the ginseng to Mr. Stevens. Instead, he decides he's going to get a much larger profit by cutting out the middleman. and contracting to ship his ginseng to China on his own. So if he does this, he could make $4,500 from the ginseng instead of 3,000. And at that point, boy, they really are in the Martin Harris, world of wealth. Um, Unfortunately, what actually happens is Joseph puts the ginseng on a boat, and Stevens's son secures passage to China on the same boat. And we don't know all the details of how he does it, but what we know from Lucy's journal is that, or Lucy's autobiography, is that Smiths learn later that Stevens' son goes on the boat and basically takes all the profits of the ginseng himself, represents it as belonging to him, and brings nothing back for the Smiths except they wind up with this chest of tea. Now, I don't know if that came from the boat person or from Stevens' son or what. Even though the ginseng had actually brought a lot of profit, they didn't get it. So they lost all the ginseng. Then it turns out that the local farmers to whom they had extended credit, the crops failed that year. And so the Smiths couldn't receive any cash from those farmers. And that meant that the wholesaler that they had to pay for the goods that they had sold couldn't be paid either. So they owed the wholesaler something like $1,800. And what winds up happening is they have to sell their farm for $800, and they ship off the entire $1,000 savings that Lucy Mack had saved from her wedding gift. And they pay their debt, but they lose every single asset they had in a single summer. Well, in the course of basically from a January all the way through the harvest time, which would have been, call it September to November, they lose in a single year. They go from a $5,000 net worth to zero. And at that point, they enter into a really precarious place, which is they don't have any assets. They live, as Joseph Smith Jr. would put it later, they were doomed to the necessity of obtaining a scanty maintenance by their daily labor. They were workers and not owners. When Joseph says doomed to the necessity of obtaining a scanty maintenance by his daily labors, that's what he's lamenting when he later says that in his autobiography, that was the kind of boy he was. They didn't own anything. Now, some of you are saying, well, what about the farm in Palmyra? Well, let's fast forward to that. So the Smiths lose all of these sort of advantages that they got from being from middle-class families, or even upper middle-class families. And they decide to move to Palmyra in large part because they're told that farms are selling very cheaply in that part of upstate New York. And supposedly, and when they first move to Palmyra, they don't buy a farm. They run a little, I think we mentioned this last time, they run a snack and refreshments shop in town. And they have a little cart that they take out to the revivals and sell popcorn and beer and stuff like that. They do, though, in Palmyra, get the chance to buy a farm again, but they buy the farm on credit. So different than before when they owned their first farm free and clear because Joseph and his brothers had done all this work on it for all these years, and they didn't have anything they owed on it. This one they bought entirely on credit. The way it worked is they had an annual payment that they had to make right after the harvest. And if they failed to make their payment, then the land agent, there was an agent there who was working for a set of speculators who were from Massachusetts who actually owned the farm, could take back the farm, including all of the improvements that they made. So if they cleared land, they didn't get any compensation for that. If they built a house, they didn't get any compensation for that. The owner could just simply take back the farm. The first year, they made the payment, no problem. The second year, the land agent never showed up to collect the payment that they were supposed to make. And we don't know what they did with the money, but Richard Bushman has I think is a pretty decent speculation about it, which is we know that about that time that the land agent never showed up to collect the money, they started building the big frame house that you can now see. If you go to Palmyra, you'll see that there are two dwellings on the Smith's land. One is a replica of the cabin that they lived in at the time that Joseph Smith was visited by Moroni, and the other is a replica of a very beautiful frame house that they built later. And there's a decent reason to believe that what actually happened there was they took the money that was owed to the agent, and because he didn't show up to collect it, it wound up getting spent to build this house. About 3 years, 2 to 3 years later, the agent showed up and they couldn't pay. And they would have gotten kicked off their farm entirely, except that there was a local farmer, I think his name was Lemuel Durfee, if I'm not mistaken, who was a Shaker or a Quaker, I can't remember which, who bought the farm, basically made the payments for them, took over their contract to buy the farm, and now they were renters again on this farm that they had built with their own hands. Cleared 300 acres, which is an astonishing amount to do in a single year. And then they wound up clearing more, and then built 2 houses on it, and in the end did not wind up owning that farm either. So that's the situation the Smiths were in terms of cash at the time, in terms of their standing in the world. And what that would do is, as each boy comes of age, the Smiths lose out on workers who would otherwise be able to contribute to the family economy. So around this time, the Smiths would both work on their own farm, but then in their spare, quote unquote, spare time, they would go and work on other people's farms. Joseph Jr. was a great worker who was hired. And in fact, there are witnesses who say that from that time period that not only was he a good worker, but he was able to get the other boys to work. And that he was somebody that they loved to hire because of that. And all the Smiths were doing that. Alvin was doing it. Hiram was doing it. Joseph Smith Jr. was doing it. And the purpose was to try to get enough into the family that they could then start to not only complete the farm they were in, but then go buy other farms so that as each boy came of age, they would have a place to raise their family. Having lost the farm, everybody kind of had to start over. And that happened to them twice in their lifetime. So I think it's important for us to put that in perspective, because a lot of what gets talked about Joseph at this time from enemies of the church and from enemies of Joseph, hostile witnesses, so to speak, is, the Smiths were always looking for a way to make a buck. They were doing these treasure digging expeditions, which involved, weird magical incantations of various kinds and that kind of stuff. And it gets talked about a lot, and we're going to talk about it. But I wanted to, before we did, I think it's important to kind of paint that historical picture. Now, Cam, do you have questions or thoughts that you think people might want to know about that story or those stories, or what are your thoughts on that?
One point that you made to me a few weeks ago that I think maybe would be worth emphasizing or drawing out a bit more is you said the Smiths weren't poor, they were broke.
Oh yeah.
Say a bit more about what you mean by that, and maybe how that would have affected the way that they saw themselves and saw life and saw uh, their needs and their situation. And
well, that's a really good point, if I do say so myself, about my own point that I made a while ago. The Smiths were not poor, they were broke. The idea that you're poor is like a culture more than it is about how much money is in your bank account, if that makes sense. The Smiths were not poor. They were broke, though. They didn't have any money. But they both came from really, really, really exceptionally respectable backgrounds. Lucy Mack's father wrote a quite long autobiography, which is fascinating reading. Really, if you want to read something that's a piece from the period that's really interesting, you can read Solomon Mack's autobiography. Solomon Mack talks about how his story is, I kept trying to get money, and that was the only thing I ever cared about, and I could never get it. The funny part is he has money all the time in the story. He's always having money. He's like owing people hundreds or even thousands of dollars and paying it off and then doing this. And he ran a business equipping troops in the French and Indian War. And he ran a schooner up and down the eastern seaboard, taking goods around and provided quite a nice life for his family, actually, although he wasn't ever around and he didn't have God in his life. And that's kind of his real point is I was unhappy because I didn't have God in my life. But you read that and you're like, wow, okay. And Lucy's brother was very, very successful, so successful that he could give his little sister $1,000 as a wedding present. You know, the price of a middle class farm, and then some as a wedding present. And Lucy's sister, Lydia, we don't know much about her, but we know that Lucy writes in her autobiography that she sought for riches and obtained them. And then Joseph Sr.'s family. This is a family that immigrated to the United States of America, which wasn't, of course, the United States of America, but to the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1638, and very, very quickly became very respectable. How do we know? Well, a couple of reasons. One, they were full members of the Congregational Church. They were entitled to vote. They could give testimony. They had enough money that they were Samuel Smith, I guess, who was Joseph Smith Sr.'s grandfather. So you've got Joseph Jr., Joseph Sr., Asiel Smith, who was the one we talked about, who was a Universalist, and then Samuel Smith. Samuel Smith was elected moderator of the town council. Samuel Smith was on the Committee of Safety, these were the committees that were part of the Revolutionary War effort and part of the rebellion against England in the late 1700s, and was a moderator of the town meeting, and was a selectman, and was, potentially, arguably one of the most respected and respectable characters in Topsfield, Massachusetts, which was not far from Salem, about 13, 14 miles from Salem, Massachusetts. So that's the background that these folks come from. And that's why Joseph Smith Sr.'s family, Asiel was able to do for his boys what Joseph Smith Sr., it now looked like in the 1820s, was clear he was not going to be able to do for Joseph Smith Sr. was not going to be able to do for his boys, which is give them a farm, give them a place, give them some stability, sort of catapult them into being owners instead of workers. And that's what I meant when I said that the Smiths were broke rather than poor. They had a certain lifestyle or expectation that they were raised with, and that they felt, I don't know if they felt entitled to it or not. I have no idea. I assume they did, though. Everybody feels a little bit like that, right? You have culture that you come from.
There's an interesting study in psychology that it's been replicated, but essentially the idea that has sort of been demonstrated is that when you have something and you lose it, you feel greater pain over never having had it in the first place.
Ah, yeah, great point. Yeah, so these
Which
are
I think
people
maybe
who,
is to sum up what you're getting at here.
there you go. I mean, these are people who, listen, of the people who are listening to us right now, Kim, how many of them do you suspect have a demonstrable net worth in excess of $1.5 million right now? Probably not that many. Some, surely, but that's a lot of money. And I don't know if that's exactly the comparison, but on the back of the envelope way, that's a decent way for you to get a handle on how much the Smiths prospects went from awesome, really great. I mean, these are kids who've just been married 6, 7, 8 years, and they're doing this well, to in a single year to nothing. And then they get the chance to start over, and they do the best they can. They build this beautiful home, and then circumstances conspire to where they wind up again with nothing. So that's really that's tough. That's tough for anybody. Other thoughts, Cam, on any of that?
Um, on the financial piece, I don't think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
So so let's talk about the sources that we have for this era because I think it's worth you got to show your work. If you want to do this right, you got to show your work so people can make their own judgments if they want to. So the sources that we have for this era of Joseph's life are obviously we have Joseph's 1838 history, which is a backwards looking way of looking at it, but it's got a lot of relevance because it's obviously firsthand from somebody who knew in this case Joseph. We have Lucy Mack's history that she writes in the 1840s um, with the help of the Corets, and then you have a bunch of affidavits that were entered into in connection with a book that was published in 1832 in Kirtland, Ohio, by the editor of the Painesville Telegraph, Eber D. Howe. The book was called Mormonism Unveiled. If you look for Mormonism Unveiled and you spell unveiled correctly, you will find the wrong book. You will find John D. Lee's book, John D. Lee of the Mountain Meadows Massacre infamy. You will find his book. So you want Mormonism Unveiled spelled Unvailed. That's Eber D. Howe's book. And it's a pretty straightforward anti-Mormon tract written by the editor of a newspaper in Painesville, Ohio, not far from where the Saints were, who went to Kirtland. Richard Bushman, I think, gives him way too much credit for the work that he does in terms of gathering quote unquote evidence, but he does gather a lot of affidavits. And he gathers affidavits from a bunch of people who knew or claimed to have known Joseph Smith back in this era. And you can find copies of it online. It's not copyrighted anymore because it's real old. It's not hard to find, and you can read the affidavits for yourself if you'd like. And it's actually interesting. A lot of it's garden variety sort of anti-Mormonism. A lot of the arguments aren't all that useful or even relevant to humans these days. But the affidavits are interesting. There's a couple of problems with this way of proceeding if you want to know the truth about what's happened. One of them is that the only affidavits we get to see in Mormonism Unveiled are the ones that were given by people who were willing to say something bad about the Smiths, right? So, Richard Bushman, I think, gives these affidavits way too much credit because the way that you got into the book is to be willing to say something bad about the Smiths. And I may have the publication date wrong. It might be 1834. I said 32. It might be 34. But at any rate, because some of these statements are from 1833. So it's important not to take them too straightforwardly. These affidavits are interesting and they're very helpful in lots of ways, but they are a complete mixed bag. And not only are they a mixed bag, they're a mixed bag in each affidavit is a mixed bag. So you have a guy, for example, you got a guy called Peter Ingersoll. Undoubtedly, Peter Ingersoll knew the Smiths. The Smiths don't even, if I remember right, there's an account in which the Smiths, I can't remember if it's Lucy or Joseph himself, who talks about Peter Ingersoll doing something that Peter Ingersoll agrees Peter Ingersoll did, which is he drove Joseph back to Harmony with Joseph and Emma back to Harmony. So after Joseph and Emma had eloped, they went back to Harmony after she wrote to her dad and was assured that she could come pick up her things. They took their stuff that they had that they'd accumulated while living with the Smith family in Palmyra. And Peter Ingersoll was the one who drove them down there. And we know that's true. Now, what's interesting about it is Peter Ingersoll also says a bunch of stuff that's absolutely ridiculous. Like so stupid that there's no chance that it's true. Zero chance. For example, he claims that Joseph Smith Sr. said to him that the best time for digging for money, and I'm quoting, was in the heat of the summer, when the heat of the sun caused the chests of money to rise near the top of the ground. That is to say, there were chests of money all throughout the allegedly, according to Peter Ingersoll, Joseph Smith Sr. believed there were chests of money all around in the ground around, and that the heat of the sun would cause the chests of the money to rise near the top. You notice, said he, the large stones on the top of the ground. We call them rocks, and they truly appear so, but they are, in fact, most of them, chests of money raised by the heat of the sun. Now, I'm not trying to be too harsh on Peter Ingersoll, but there is exactly zero chance that Joseph Smith Sr. believed that the rocks that you saw all around you were actually chests of money. There's just no chance he believed that. We have lots of people who knew Joseph Smith Sr. over his lifetime. And not one of them, except for Peter Ingersoll and these other people, would ever say that Joseph Smith Sr. believed something as stupid and weird and crazy as that. Peter Ingersoll says some other things that are ridiculous. In Peter Ingersoll's world, Joseph, at one point, when talking to Peter Ingersoll and actually talking to, in the presence of Peter Ingersoll claims that Joseph, quote, wept and acknowledged that he could not see in a stone now, nor ever could, that his former pretensions in that respect were all false, and that all of the stuff that he had said about these gold plates, there was never any such book, and that it was all false, and he was just trying to see what he could get out of it. Now, anybody who knows anything about Joseph Smith, it's an absurd thing to claim that he said that. And for him to have said that to Peter Ingersoll, of all people, and not anybody else, is ridiculous. We know Joseph, in the end, not only believed, but gave his life for his belief. So this idea that Joseph Smith suddenly, in a moment of weakness, confesses that the whole thing's garbage to Peter Ingersoll is just insane. There are lots of other things that Peter Ingersoll says that are insane. But there are also some things that he says that are true. And so how do you sort what's true and what isn't? And how do you figure out to what extent any of this has validity? Well, there are some things that he says that other people seem to agree with. But how do we know that those are legitimate? And the answer is we don't. And I just wanted to say that these things exist. There's lots of claims about Joseph having been a quote unquote money digger or a treasure digger. To be clear, every reference that I know of, contemporary reference that I know of to Joseph Smith being involved in quote unquote magical practices, is not a reference to Joseph performing spells, strictly speaking, or to Joseph doing anything other than being able to look into a stone and see treasure and going out digging for treasure. That reference seems to be, a lot of people seem to think Joseph did that, including Martin Harris and Joseph Knight, who were both Mormons. So from that, I think it is safe to conclude that Joseph did something like that at times and was somewhat known for that. So what do we make of that? Cam, thoughts on that?
Well, we've kind of maybe backed into this a little bit. So maybe for continuity's sake and the narrative, where would you kind of place the introduction of this in the story of, okay, so we've got the Smiths, we've got the financial situation they find themselves in, working on their own farm but not owning it. At some point around 14, Joseph has this remission of sins type experience that we discussed a couple episodes ago. So just maybe help us see in the context of Joseph's life, how and where would you frame where all of this kind of comes together? Because we're
Yeah.
looking at it right now, I guess through the affidavit several years back into the past. But if we were to look at the story chronologically, what would that tell us?
Yeah, I think okay, there's a couple other pieces here that we need to talk about. One of the revelations that I think Latter-day Saints, Latter-day Saints, and I say revelations, I mean things that you can learn as you get into church history that really disturbs modern Latter-day Saints, and I don't think there's any dispute about it, is that Joseph Smith Sr. had a drinking problem. I don't think there's any uh, real dispute about it. And the reason I say that is because there are witnesses who mention it. Peter Ingersoll, by the way, is one of them. Willard Chase mentions it. And and in addition to that, Joseph Smith Sr. himself mentions it in his patriarchal blessing to Hyrum Smith. So I don't think so. That's something that, it just is what it is. I think Joseph Smith Sr. had a drinking problem. Well, can we understand why he would have a drinking problem? How do you think Joseph Smith Sr. feels as a man, as a provider, as a as the leader of his home, given that he has not been able to support the family and to prepare for the future in the way that meets his expectations and that meets the expectations of his wife and of their families at the time that they got married. By this time, Joseph Smith Sr. feels like a failure. And he's begun drinking. And why do we have these treasure digging stories that come up from around the same time that the Smiths lose the farm? And why do we have accounts of Joseph Smith Sr. saying crazy things related to treasure digging? I suppose there is one way in which Peter Ingersoll could be telling the truth, which is Joseph Smith Sr. could have been exceptionally drunk and said some weird stuff. That's possible. But all of this is consistent with the idea that the Smiths would begin, possibly, and by the way, not Joseph Smith Jr. so much as Joseph Smith Sr., looking for a way to solve for the money problems, the monetary problems that they were facing. How do they solve for those? Well, one way might be if they could find some treasure. And if they believe that the treasure exists, and by the way, whether Joseph Smith Sr. is the one who comes up with the idea that there's treasure in them thar hills, or whether it's brought up by all of these witnesses who, by the way, testify that they're involved in treasure digging with Joseph Smith, like Willard Chase, for example, and scrying, which is looking in a stone to see things far away. That's called scrying. Dowsing, which is the working with a rod, it's moderately clear that the working with a rod is referred to in respect of Oliver Cowdery in one section of the Doctrine and Covenants. So I don't think that's unclear. So there's a lot of evidence here that the Smiths get involved in this kind of what we'll call magical practice, but really it's a practice designed to solve a problem that they have. And I think it's related. I think it's pretty clear from a timeline perspective that it's related to Joseph Smith Sr.'s development of an alcohol problem of some kind. I don't know if he was ever what we would call an alcoholic or not. No way to know. We don't know where he got the idea that there would be treasure that could be found in the hills, but we can understand pretty straightforwardly why that would be an appealing idea to him. And we can also understand that why Joseph Smith Jr., who was undoubtedly, after the experience of the first vision, deemed to be someone who had spiritual gifts, would be someone whom his father would want to draw in to giving and to being involved in, to giving aid to this kind of a venture. So the whole thing kind of makes sense in a way, doesn't it? Do you have thoughts about that, Cam?
Well, and my understanding too is, and maybe to a point just that you're making here, because they're involved with other people, um, this was sort of the water they were swimming in a sense. It's
I
not
don't think
like,
there's any question of that. I don't
yeah,
think there's any doubt of that at all.
yeah.
Well, you
And-
have to remember. Oh,
Go
sorry.
ahead.
I was going to say, you have to remember Joseph Smith Sr. is an unconventional religious thinker anyway. He is not somebody who is thinking about things in sort of, but he's absolutely a Christian. And by the way, so are Willard Chase and Peter Ingersoll. They would fight you if you tried to suggest otherwise. And all of the other people who are involved in the same kind of stuff are believing Christians. 100%. It's just that this is how some believing Christians' beliefs wound up manifesting themselves. Joseph Smith Sr. testifies, as far as we know. I have some doubts about the authenticity of this alleged testimony, but let's just take it at face value. He testifies at one point in a court trial that Joseph Smith Jr.'s ability to see, his ability to see into a steer stone and see things that are far away, is a gift from God. And that he is to some extent ashamed, that is Joseph Smith Sr., wishes that Joseph Smith Jr. could use it or would use it or understands why he wants to use it only for the glory of God and not for looking for treasure anymore. But it was not viewed as some separate, weird, magical thing, but it was instead viewed as this is one of the ways in which the gifts of God can manifest themselves. Dowsing, the ability to find things with a rod seems weird to us, but it's still done to find where to dig wells all the time in this day and age in 2025 of all time. So
We probably take for granted too, in like a more modern materialist world, the fact that 200 years ago, the relationship between spiritual realities, supernatural realities, and your everyday uh, going about living life were very interconnected.
Well, that's a great point. Yeah, we would not necessarily attribute things that happen to us as being spiritual at the same rate that maybe somebody then would. Is that a way of restating kind of what you're saying?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you have this situation where you've got a head of the household who's struggling. And Richard Bushman goes so far as to say that Alvin functionally becomes the head of the household. Joseph Smith Sr.'s blessing to Hiram in the patriarchal blessing, he actually talks to Hiram and says how one of the reasons that he's so blessed is because of his faithfulness in supporting his family and his father. And even says, and when he, meaning Joseph Smith Sr., when he, your father, has been out of the way, through wine, you have stuck with him and stuck by him. So I don't think it makes sense. And it's a very clear picture of a guy who was disappointed in life, who developed a bit of an alcohol problem, pre-word of wisdom. Let's all be clear. It was not wrong for them, although, alcoholism was a known thing and certainly not, something anybody wanted to get involved in. It was to some extent shameful to be drinking that much, but still, Joseph Smith Sr. goes there. His kids are supporting him. His kids are involved in working this out, and he drafts potentially his son Joseph Smith Jr. into some of the schemes and the things that he's trying to do. Lucy Smith, in her draft of her autobiography, also mentions this stuff. And her basic point is not that the Smiths never engaged in trying to find lost magical objects or lost treasures or whatever, but instead, her point is that they did not just do that. They never stopped working. She was defending against the idea that the Smiths were lazy. They were not lazy. And I think that's quite easily demonstrated when you actually look at some of and we don't have a lot of these because Eber D. Howe was not interested in their testimony. But we do have some. Martin Harris is one. Joseph Knight is one. Josiah Stoll is one. And there are a couple of others that we have from the era who will tell you, no, the Smiths are the farthest thing from lazy. Um, and, they are doing these things potentially looking for treasures to solve their money problems, but they are not doing them um, to the exclusion of other business, as Lucy puts it in her autobiography.
What is
Which
it
is
she says
also important.
specifically?
What's that?
What is it that Lucy Smith says specifically?
She says, one need not suppose that we focused our efforts on the faculty of abrac, which is a reference to a magical kind of a formula that's used in these kind of treasure digging kind of things.
Like abracadabra.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. To the exclusion of other business. We never did so, or something like that. I'm paraphrasing, but that's the basic gist of it. So you've got Lucy talking about it. You have Martin Harris talking about it. Joseph Knight talking about it. You have Joseph Smith talking about it. And Joseph Smith tosses it off a little bit by saying, hey, there was this Josiah Stoll fellow. That's why everybody calls me a treasure digger. There was probably more to it than that, but that was a big part of it because, in fact, after going to work with Josiah Stoll for a while, it seems that Joseph was brought up on charges of being a vagrant person because he was pretending, quote unquote, to see things in a stone and looking for treasure on behalf of Josiah Stoll. So there you go. I mean, that's basically what the history says and what you know. Now, Cam, you and I talked about some principles related to the desires that we have and the way that they get sanctified and changed that I think really relate to how one might think about the visit of the angel Moroni and the plates and those things in relation to this activity that it seems like at least Joseph Smith Sr. and to some lesser extent Joseph Smith Jr. And maybe some of the other boys were involved in. So here you have a boy, and really Joseph Smith is still in 1823, still very much a boy, who is, we know the financial circumstances of the Smith family at the time. We've got a pretty good idea of what's likely to be going on with Joseph Smith Sr. at the time in terms of him, his drinking has gotten not great, it seems. He's involved in, looking for buried treasure along with it seems like half or more of his neighbors. Joseph Smith Jr. receives this visit from Moroni. And this is a thoroughly biblical angel. One of the things about that was interesting that made the salamander letter, which for those of you who don't know, was a forgery created by a guy named Mark Hoffman from the 80s, where some of the angelic stuff gets transmuted into visions of a salamander, and a salamander has some specific magical spirit meanings that whatever. That's why he chose the salamander. One of the reasons why it was so acceptable and so easily accepted by scholars, and so because they thought it would make more sense to have a Joseph Smith who was a magical person, and they preferred it to the idea of him seeing biblical angels. And so they were trying to make this case, but there really isn't any evidence to make the case that Moroni was related to magical stuff, or very little at any rate. And so the salamander letter would have completed something that I think everybody would admit they kind of wanted to be completed. But in fact, Moroni comes, and he comes with a thoroughly Christian message, an eschatological message, I guess you would even say, a last days message, an end times message. And among other things, he says, hey, guess what? There really is a treasure. And remember, what's one of the very first things, even in Joseph's 1838 account, that Moroni says to Joseph Smith about this buried treasure that he's now talking to him about?
Is this the commandment to essentially not look at it as something that you can use to get rich?
Yeah, he says, I must have no other object in obtaining the plates He warns him against obtaining the plates that Satan would try to tempt him in consequences of the indigent circumstances of my father's family to get the plates for the purpose of getting rich. This he forbade me, saying that I must have no other object in view but the glory of God, or I could not obtain them. This is Moroni in 1823, according to Joseph Smith in 1838. The very first things that he says, one of the very first things that he says is, you have to become pure. So, what happens next? Well, after Joseph has the vision of Moroni, the next thing that happens is he is actually guided to the place where the plates are. He knows what it looks like. He sees it. He gets a lever. He opens up the box and he sees the plates. Now, there's something happens here that we rarely talk about, but I think we should talk about it more because it's a relevant and a really important thing to understand. So Joseph Smith didn't write about this incident until a few years later. But in 1834 and 1835, Oliver Cowdery wrote a history of his experiences that was actually published and was written and published about the beginnings of the church. And he was actually writing this from Missouri, sending it, publishing it in the paper, which was then getting sent to Joseph, without Joseph even being involved, by the way, in sort of editing it or mediating what would be written there. And one of the things that Oliver mentions is that when Joseph first encounters the plates, he is overcome by temptation. And the temptation that he's overcome by is exactly the temptation that Moroni warned him about. The temptation that he's overcome by is the temptation to get the plates for the purpose of getting rich. He sees them and he immediately thinks, I can solve all of the money problems that we have. I can solve all of our respectability problems. I can solve my dad's drinking problem. I can solve all of this stuff if I can get these plates. And he immediately begins to reach for them. And what happens is he is literally, according to Oliver, thrown backwards, bodily thrown backwards. And then he goes to try to reach the plates again. And the same thing happens. He is physically thrown backwards and he cannot touch the plates. And then he goes to reach them again. And he's physically thrown backwards and can't get the plates. And then Moroni appears. And Moroni explains to him that the reason he can't get the plates is because he's given into this temptation. This is a really, really interesting thing. And in the end, he is supposed to bring somebody with him at the time that he obtains them. There's some reasons to think that was probably Alvin Smith. But the bottom line of it is, the reason Moroni comes to visit him every year and teaches him more things every year is in part so that Joseph can slowly change his mindset and begin to feel the way that he needs to feel about obtaining the plates so that he can actually get them. So here's what we have. We have a guy who's been through these things. He comes from this background. He's warned about it. He goes to get the plates. He's thrown backwards, and then he's warned again. And then he's told, come back in a year, or I will visit you in a year. But he does. He goes back in a year. And Joseph, even at the time that he obtains the plates, by the way, people know that these plates, and it's hard to know how much of what people are saying about the Smiths claiming that treasure exists is based on the Smiths talking to them about this experience that Joseph has with Moroni, and people interpolating that to mean that they found the treasure. Do you know what I'm saying? It's really hard to disentangle that. you know, to go back to our good buddy, Peter Ingersoll, he actually says that Joseph Smith Sr. told him that he had found a big treasure in a cave with all this treasure in it. William Stafford says very similar things. Willard Chase says similar stuff. And we learned something that's really, really interesting, which is there are quite a number of witnesses. And of the witnesses, these are the ones that I actually find to be the most, what I would say, the most, what do I call it? The ones that seem least outlandish in their claims in general. These are relatives, most of them, relatives of Joseph Smith on his wife's side. So these are mostly Isaac Hale's cousins, and folks like that. Many of these people testify that Joseph at one time or another told them that they would be able to see the plates. And Lucy Smith is supposed to have told people that after the plates were done being translated and the words got out there, the Lord's work with the plates was done, that after that, the Smiths would be able to put the plates on display, and that this would be a way by which God would alleviate the poverty of the Smiths. So that, in fact, both things could be done. Both the work of God and the desire to sort of solve for the Smiths' money problems would both be taken care of. For example, just to give you a couple of examples, there's a fellow whose name is Nathaniel Lewis. He's an elder in one of the churches, and he says, at one time, however, Joseph Smith Jr. came to my house and asked my advice whether he should proceed to translate the Book of Plates or not. He said God had commanded him to translate it, but he was afraid of people. He remarked that he was to exhibit the plates to the world at a certain time, which was then about 18 months distant. Now, I don't know when that allegedly happened, but, and I told him I was not qualified to give advice in such cases, and Smith frequently said to me that I should see the plates at the time appointed. After the time stipulated had passed away, Smith, being at my house, was asked why he did not fulfill his promise to show me the plates and prove himself an honest man. He replied that he himself was deceived, but that I should see them if I were where they were. And basically, I reminded him then that I stated at the time that he made the promise I was fearful the enchantment would be powerful and removed the plates at the time that came in which they were to be revealed, which is a snide way of saying, I don't think you're really going to show them to me because I don't think they really exist, which is fine. And at any rate, these are the kinds of things that he is alleged by people who seem to be the more sober of these issuers of affidavits to have said. And there's also witnesses who say that Joseph did not believe that he was the one who was supposed to translate the plates, that he believed that they would be translated in some other way. There are people who say that Joseph Smith's own firstborn child was the one who was supposed to translate the plates. So there's lots of stories, and some of these appear to me, at least, to be potentially true. The reason I like this, and I will tell you that I understand that these stories can be weird. I don't find them weird at all. In fact, what I find from them is, and I'm interested in your reaction, Cam, but when I hear these things, what I conclude is that Joseph Smith went through his life very much the way that I go through mine, which is that he was guided and directed at times and given very specific, clear direction at times. And then at other times, he was trying to discern things and was done and did so incorrectly in some way or another, and learned through his process, just like all of us do, how to do the work that he'd been asked to do. And so my conclusion is, it appears to me at least that the Smiths at one point did see the gold plates as a way by which they're, as both a gift of God to the world that needed to be translated, and that the message of which would change the world, and a way that their money problems would also be solved. Not through the founding of a church, but through displaying the plates. Pretty straightforward, or selling them, or something like that. So to me, this demonstrates actually a really straightforward way in which the Smiths may well have been deceived at one time about the way that the plates were going to be used and the way that that whole thing was going to play out. And I think there's something really powerful about the way that God can use us in our imperfections, in the things that we desperately want, but which are not necessarily allotted to us, to then do his work. And that was kind of what I was alluding to earlier, Cam. And you may, I don't know if you think now is the time to address it, but I think that's probably a good time.
Yeah, so something that we talked about recently, there's an oft-repeated phrase in the Doctrine and Covenants that says, if you have desires to serve God, you're called to the work. Um, and Josh and I had a really good conversation about the principle of desire. Where's this fit in the larger picture of being a disciple of Christ? Just in the realm of spiritual things, where does desire factor in? One way that I think, well, I guess I'll just say the way that I've read this my entire life up until recently is if you have desires to serve God, then you qualify to be called. Or if you want to get called, then you have to have desires.
Yeah. Yeah. That's how I
Um,
would.
right. It's a very proactive sort of thing. You know, if you want to be called, then you get the desires, and then you got the calling. Um, when in fact, what I think occurred to both of us as we talked about this recently is I think what it's saying is that if you have desires, you've been called. That it's evidence that the Lord is calling you through your desires to serve Him. If you have desires to serve God, you are called to the work. That the Lord uses our desires, the pure ones that He gives us, in order to call us to Him. And it's not to say that all desires are equally pure and equally noble and equally inspired, but that we have actual desires that come from within, right? That we ourselves feel that have been given to us by the Lord, and that all desires actually are are callings from some spirit. Some spirit is calling to us, and these are the places that our desires show up. I don't know if I'm saying this very clearly. Desires to serve the Lord are evidence of a calling from Him. It's the evidence of His voice calling to us. Um,
Yeah.
anyway, I'm talking in circles at this point, so maybe I'll kick it over to you to say a few things, and I'll just
Well,
on that.
I think maybe a way to say what you're saying is all desires that are in fact desires to serve God are gifts from God. Sometimes we read in the scriptures that, no good thing can come unto us without the Holy Ghost, without the influence of our Father. And our desires, which are in fact desires to serve God, are planted in our hearts. But those desires are pretty easy to change and pervert to mean something else. And most of us walk around with mixed motives most of the time, don't we? And so it shouldn't be surprising that Joseph Smith, just like all of us, wandered around with motives that ultimately were mixed motives. Meaning, on one hand, he wanted to serve the Lord. He wanted to do what he'd been asked to do in this calling. And that was his desire. But by the same token, he had other desires. We all do. For example, he had a desire to help to redeem his family, not in the spiritual sense, although he probably had that as well, but also in a physical sense, because the needs of the Smiths were real, and the shame that his father was feeling was real, and the shame that his mother was feeling was real, and the those things were real desires, and the desire to do those things to help change the situation of his family was on some level a righteous desire, on another level not, right? God always works through our desires, though. And the things that we want can start out to be impure, and through a process of following and listening and being submissive to our Heavenly Father, can become sanctified to us. Just as many of the things that we see in this story of Joseph Smith did for him. The prophet began, perhaps, under the influence of his father, to search for treasures, to look into a seer stone and scry, and to try to solve the problems that he felt that he would have felt very acutely that his family had. And that desire was used and gradually sanctified to be the search for the opportunity to serve God. Because Joseph had a foundation that had been laid by his parents, that had been laid by his first vision experience, that God was real. He didn't doubt this by this time. He knew God was real. He knew God heard his prayers. And yet he was looking for a solution to his problems. That desire drove him to find more things and learn more things. And eventually that desire was purified and sanctified until it became the desire to bring forth the Book of Mormon, and the willingness to continue to endure poverty for the rest of his life. The Smiths would never again own the property that they lived in. Not Joseph Jr., not Joseph Sr. The only exception would be in Nauvoo, when Joseph lived in the Nauvoo mansion house. But even then, Joseph only owned a small piece of it. If you're reading the Doctrine and Covenants, he had to put in for a share of stock, just like everybody else in the mansion house. Joseph ultimately was able to shed and to allow the Spirit and the Lord to purify his desires so that they aligned with what the Lord wanted for him. And
Okay.
that's how he was ultimately able to bring forth the Book of Mormon. But those desires that were pre-existing that led him to it, those were also holy in their way. Just as all of the things that we have in us can be made holy and can be sanctified if we'll submit them to the Lord. So I don't know if you have any other thoughts on that, Cam, but that's kind of how I see this lining out.
You know, this is a pattern that we see show up in the scriptures time and time again, actually. One of the best examples of this is with the brother of Jared, right? So as they're getting ready to cross the ocean and they realize that they have an interior lighting problem, the brother of Jared goes to the Lord looking for an answer to that specific temporal need. And because it takes him to the Lord then uses that opportunity to answer the question, to give him a solution, right? Obviously, there's some back and forth, and he works out, something, and he takes it to him. But the Lord is using this entire process in order to get him in a position where he's ready to receive what the Lord wants to give him, which is a revelation of all things the end from the beginning. And there are so many instances where this same thing happens in the Doctrine and Covenants, where Joseph and company will go with a specific question about a specific verse or something that's happening in their immediate sphere, and the Lord will answer it and then use that question, the thing that drove them to him, he'll use that opportunity to then expand and teach them something bigger. He's almost using it, let's say, as like a window to get through to them through their desire, through their interest, through their need, right? And so I see this story as following the same pattern, which is to say, Joseph went out looking for treasure, looking for gold, in an attempt to redeem his family physically, temporally, as you put it. Um, and the Lord had something better in store that would work to his purposes to, ultimately bring about spiritual redemption for his family, but not just for his family, for uh, millions yet unknown. So
I love that.
that's sort of my take on this. To your point, Josh, I think the Lord can take our desires and can elevate them and sanctify them and use them for his purposes. So,
Yeah. Well, and some of the things that Joseph developed as a result of his desires were things the Lord could use. The talent of scrying. One of the things that's fascinating. I'm not going to get into this too much here. We'll talk about it probably in the very next episode. But one of the things that's really interesting about Joseph uh, and about early accounts, I know that the church has sort of officially endorsed the idea of the seer stone in a hat. I'm not saying I disagree with that necessarily, but my sense is when you look at the historical sources and somebody says that Joseph used a seer stone and somebody else says he used the Urim and Thummim, they're both talking about the same thing. The saints didn't see those as different things, is my impression. And I think I've got pretty good reasons for that, which I'll lay out in another episode. But um, when Joseph first got the plates, the thing he was most excited about was not the plates, it was the Urim and Thummim. He said he could see anything by looking in the Urim and Thummim, that his vision was remarkable and clear, that it was different than what he had experienced before. So it's important, I think, to acknowledge the ways in which our desires can lead us to places and give us skills and understanding and ability that actually can be used by the Lord later, even though at the time the thing that we got was maybe not what was ultimately expected of us. Even the parts of us that are broken and damaged can be exceptionally useful. Think about if you're a young man or a young woman who's committed a sin and needs to go talk to a bishop. Do you want the bishop who doesn't know anything about what it's like to be tempted and who doesn't know what it's like to go walk that road that you've walked? Or do you want the bishop who knows all about it and knows that path? Even those broken parts of us, those things that we do that are wrong, can be used and redeemed and turned into the very blessings that we seek. That principle is so important and so crucial. You just can't overstate it. And in that sense, Richard Bushman is entirely right about one thing about this process, the treasure digging and the sort of scrying and these folk practices that Joseph was involved in. Those served as almost a kind of preparatory priesthood or a preparatory set of understandings that helped him to know how to do what he needed to do. Could Joseph have eventually translated the Book of Mormon if he had had no exposure to and no understanding of how to look and how to see? Possibly not. Possibly he needed that experience and that understanding to be able to do what he wound up being able to do.
I think it's probably worth saying that and maybe we should have even mentioned this earlier, because I think a big question that people have when they get into this is this stuff real? Where should this fit theologically in my own framework of the way that the world works? And um, I think the answer is yeah. Like there are supernatural realities um, that exist. I don't know that I would say anything is neutral, strictly speaking. Um, Although I don't know. Maybe it just depends. But there are places in which spiritual things, spiritual realities flourish. And anyway, I guess the point I'm getting at is your point, which is this gave Joseph an opportunity to develop a naturally born spiritual gift that he had, which the Lord could later then elevate and consecrate to his purposes.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think this is not that different than lots of things and how those can be turned by the Lord into something beautiful. I think a lot of people who struggle and who are tempted feel that they're lesser as a result. And I think the thing to think, or the way to think about that, that is more appropriate might be to think of it instead as a gift that you have that is at present unsanctified, not holy. A desire, yes, but it is not yet a desire to serve God. But that the seeds of a desire to serve God are in all of your desires. They can all be made holy. They can all be sanctified and turned towards the Lord. And when they are, the Lord can use you to accomplish things that he otherwise perhaps could not have used you to accomplish. And I really think that is the message that we should take from Joseph Smith's early life. Um, and that's really all I guess I have to say about that, Kim.
It's the spirit of resurrection and redemption, right? I mean, this is what we got at last time with the idea of creation ex materia. It's that the Lord takes pre-existing raw material and he refines it and reorders it and reorganizes it for his purposes. That's the
Yes.
nature of creation. It's uh
Yes.
it's taking what is there and putting it together in a holy, beautiful way.
In a way, what we're saying about Joseph's involvement in treasure digging, to the extent that it that it took place along the lines that we are suggesting it did, it is no different in its way than Joseph's involvement in Presbyterianism and Methodism. It's something that was necessary to bring him to a place where he could receive the other things that the Lord needed to give him. And I think it's really important that we not overlook or downplay that. And I guess that's all yeah, that's probably about right. Well, thank you guys for joining us today. Cameron, thank you for everything. Thank you for being part of this. And I hope that you've learned something about Joseph Smith, about his early history that perhaps you didn't know. I hope that we've put it in a good context so you can understand kind of what was going on in the Smith family. I want you to know that those who are listening, that I have as strong of a testimony as I think there is to have of the prophetic calling of the prophet Joseph Smith. I have a desire to know more about his history and a desire to understand more about who he was as a human being and why it is that what are the things that he had to go through and why. Because I believe that very little can be as valuable to us as we try to go through our lives as understanding the challenges that somebody who was, in my judgment, undoubtedly a believer, undoubtedly called as a prophet, would have undergone in his development. And so that we can understand how we can have the same experiences that Joseph did, where to sort of borrow from Richard Bushman, or from Joseph himself, like a rough stone rolling down the hill. Pieces of us can be popped off that don't need to be there anymore. And we can be guided to the things that we really need. So thanks for joining us today. If you like what you've heard, you might hit the subscribe button. We'd love that. If you want to have more discussions, please join us on Facebook. Our group is called the Shattering Triangles Project, and we'd love to see you there. Thanks so much.